Welcome back to these series of lectures on Western civilization. We're going to talk about the new imperialism today. I'm going to define it first. We'll talk about context and significance. And then we'll look at some examples. And we'll see how far we get. Definition first. Imperialism is the policy of extending a nation's authority by conquering other people's territories or by dominating them economically or politically, establishing easy for me to say, hegemony just means dominance over other states. Context, you see the rapid acquisition of colonies by the great powers, European powers, United States, Japan, Russia. You see the rapid acquisition of colonies in Asia and in Africa especially, in the Pacific and other places. This takes place over the second half of the 19th century. Significance, well, it's an expansion of the market system of capitalism for the most part. It's an expansion of Christianity to places that had never heard of it. Sort of an expansion of the world system, that system of interlocking circuits of commerce and trade and sort of with Western Europe and the United States at the core. And of course it overturns countless traditional societies. The intrusion of the market, the intrusion of Christianity into these traditional societies in Africa and Asia are going to have dramatic impacts on the people themselves. We call this new imperialism because there was an older version of this that started with Columbus, of course. The first imperialism is that age of exploration, where Columbus and then Magellan and Cortez and on and on and on, European explorers went out across the world, establishing colonies, carving up the New World and other places in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So the new imperialism, what we're talking about, is sort of the 19th and 20th century versions of a process that had started many centuries earlier with Columbus. A little historical overview here. Much of Asia and Africa, with the exception of India, has sort of gone their own ways and had little contact with Europe. Of course, you have the rise of the Islamic empires of the Middle Ages. China, of course, a sovereign nation, and Japan at great distance. This all begins to change in the second half of the 19th century. Africa was partitioned among the European states. Vast stretches of Asia were divided up among the European powers. You can look at the map here at the key, and you can see Africa kind of sliced up like a big pizza and everybody getting a slice. You see British East Africa running from Cairo to Cape Town, that vast tract of northwestern African territory dominated by the French. You see the Belgian Congo in the center of Africa. The rubber trees there make very lucrative trade for the Belgians. You see the Germans even getting in on the act, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Italians, and so on and so forth. This takes place in Asia as well. Of course, India is sort of the crown jewel of the British Empire. You see the Dutch in Indonesia, and you see the French in Southeast Asia. And we can go on and on. You can examine the maps and take a look at the key. I guess imperialism lends itself to an increasingly one-world economy because natural resources from these far-flung places in Africa and Asia make their way back to the industrial centers of the great Western powers, where they're used in the industrial plant to create products. So an increasingly integrated economic world. It's worth noting, too, that these modern European states in the late 19th, early 20th century, they increasingly have the ability to access the loyalty and the service of their people and the natural resources of their countries to a degree that was previously unknown. You'll see this as a factor in the Great War, which will start in 1914, as these powerful Western countries just have a remarkable ability to access all their natural resources, human and otherwise. What are the sources of European power? How are they able to dominate the world in this way? Well, they have advanced science. Of course, they have research centers in universities and government-supported research facilities. This leads to greater technology and communications and weaponry. These countries have industry that need raw materials, which can be gained or accessed in these colonized areas of the world. These great powers generally have strong agricultural sectors which can feed their people. Most of these great powers are not dependent upon food from other places. Again, sophisticated transportation systems. They have navies. They have merchant marines. Transatlantic cables laid, in the second half of the 19th century. Of course, they have great military and naval institutions, these great powers in Europe and the United States, Japan. And there are certain psychological factors that give the great Western powers an advantage, sort of a sense of superiority. This has an odd mixture of altruism on the one hand and exploitation on the other. Patterns of imperialism. Speaking generally here, European nations will invest in what they regard as a backward country. And then after investing in these places, they begin to build productive enterprises. They improve the roads, lay the telegraph lines, dredge the canals or the rivers, lay railroads, et cetera, improvements. The Europeans would generally either employ or enslave the indigenous people to do this work. Of course, they extract the raw materials from these places, whether it's gold or silver or cotton or tobacco or rubber or whatever it might be, bananas, lemons, limes. These raw materials, of course, are then shipped back to the mother country where they can be turned into finished products and then sold on the open market. And of course, this turns traditional societies upside down. I mentioned this a few moments ago. Traditional practices are completely disrupted by the presence of the Europeans, both in bringing their so-called improvements to the land and bringing Christianity to the land as well. The Europeans will tend to try to guarantee their investments in these colonized places by making arrangements with the local governing elite, by either bribing them to cooperate or threatening them if they don't cooperate. Let's talk about degrees of control that are exerted by the great powers on their colonies. I'll mention three. We'll move from least severe or least hands-on to more hands-on. Sphere of influence is first. Let's face it, the entire Western Hemisphere lies to some degree within the sphere of influence of the United States, just from its physical proximity. I've heard many times the Caribbean referred to as an American lake. We can dominate it culturally, militarily, economically certainly. Sphere of influence. The great power exerts influence by sheer physical proximity to weaker or perhaps colonized territories. Next in our degree of control would be the Protectorate. Here is a little more hands-on. The great power may train the colonized armies or police forces, handpick the leadership. Best example I can think of, actually I can think of two, Hawaii and Cuba. Both were essentially protectorates of the United States after the Spanish-American War. The Americans found out that the Dole Company found out they could profit on the production of pineapple in Hawaii. And this led to great investments there and the making of a lot of money. And of course, Pearl Harbor is the most, probably the best natural harbor in the Central Pacific. So Hawaii is like a beacon out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, just luring the Americans on. The Americans will establish a protectorate over Hawaii and maintain that up until the late 50s when Hawaii is finally annexed and becomes a state of the United States. Cuba's much the same way. We trained the Cuban army, we trained the Cuban police force, we sort of handpicked the Cuban leadership to look after our interest in Cuba. not the Cuban people's interest, but the American interest. You see the same thing taking place in India, with the British in Southeast Asia, with the French in Indonesia, with the Dutch, and on and on and on. We maintain this relationship with Cuba up until what, 1959, when Castro takes over, and then he severs that relationship and causes a lot of problems. And then, of course, the most severe, the most hands-on degree of control is annexation, where you take the colonized, the colony, and make it part of the mother country. Again, like we did with Hawaii. It had been a protectorate, and then it became part of the United States. In our next segment on imperialism, we're going to talk about 4 justifications or interpretations of imperialism. We'll talk about an economic, a religious, a cultural, and strategic justifications for imperialism, and then we'll try to draw some conclusions. We'll do that next time. Thank you.